Okay, hello everybody. We are, believe it or not, in Eden, Idaho, I think. Or is it Utah? We're somewhere in Eden, camping on the Snake River. So, how strange is that? So I'm in the RV. Our Wi-Fi is definitely limited, and so I'm pre-recording this. And hopefully we will hit a spot where there's some good Wi-Fi and I can get it uploaded for you to YouTube. And the downside of it is I won't be able to show you slides. I'll be able to read them myself, but you won't be able to follow along with the slides. So if you typically depend upon that for notes, then you'll probably just have to listen and take the notes that way. For that matter, it might be better just to consider it an audio recording rather than a video, because there's not much to see behind me here but the front of the RV. At any rate, let's jump into this. And what this is, I thought, was a great way for us to wrap up the fall feasts as we're heading into a new cycle of Torah portions in Bereshit. This is a couple lessons that I did for our congregation, I think several years ago at Sukkot. And some of the material might look familiar to you. It found its way into 50,000 Degrees and Cloudy. But some of it was pretty heavy moving into the book of Revelation, because we're pulling out of, again, some of the Jewish sources and showing, what was the Jewish mindset of the first century, what was even John's mindset in the first century, and how were some of the customs of the feast, and especially Sukkot and the fall holidays, how are they linked to the things in John's vision? That's where I'd like to go. So I'm going to do it in two parts. If you could see my slides, you'd see there's around 90 of them. So again, the first part of the lesson might look familiar to you, but I don't know that the last part of the lesson has been taught, but maybe once as kind of a practice, kind of a trial run. And so we'll give it a try here. And one thing I saw just before we kick this off, in a newsletter I received last week from Ulpanur, which is a Hebrew language school, they were reflecting on the name Adam or Adam. And they brought out the point that on a basic level, the Hebrew word Adam is derived from the word Adamah, which means earth, the origin of the human body. Because that's what Adam means. It's not just a proper name, it's also mankind. They linked it linguistically to the Hebrew word domeh, which means similar to or compared to. And thus, they say the word Adam could be linked to admeh, which means I will be compared. And they say that it shows the unique creation of humankind as to how in us, because we are formed from the Adamah, but yet at the very same time we are formed Edmeh, which is to be compared to the Creator himself. And so our capacity as human beings is we can be considered the lowest of the low, made out of the dust of the earth, or if we allow his spirit to work through us, then we are comparable, we are behaving in the image of the Creator himself, the one who created us. So it gives us the opportunity each day to decide, to whom do I want to be compared today? Do I want to act like dirt, or do I want to behave like the one who created me? So I thought that was a great little tidbit that I would pass on to you. So let's go to the typical rapture text in 1 Thessalonians 4:13. And as you know, I've got quite a bit different view of the rapture Can't find that word in Scripture, but I can find resurrection. And so we stick with the concept of resurrection. And, if you think of Paul being a Pharisees, unashamed of being a Pharisee, then we have to understand what was the mindset of the Pharisees. And their big doctrine that characterized them was a belief in the resurrection. And we can see that he's faithfully passing along this belief in the resurrection, especially as he's introduced to the first fruits of resurrection from the dead, which is Yeshua. So Paul writes, "We do not want you to be uninformed, brethren, about those who are asleep, so that you will not grieve, as do the rest who have no hope. For if we believe that Yeshua died and rose again, even so God will bring with him those who have fallen asleep in Yeshua. For this we say to you by the word of the Lord, that we who are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord will not precede those who have fallen asleep." Okay, so that's the basic text that we want to work with. And here's some bullet points. We hear that the Lord himself is going to descend. The dead are going to ascend. The saints who are yet alive will go up with them. And they will meet the Lord in the cloud together. They will dwell with the presence of the Lord forever. And these words are supposed to be comforting, not terrifying. So let's kind of back up a few weeks here. Let's go back to the Feast of Trumpets. Let's go to Rosh Hashanah. And we know that it's seen in tradition as a resurrection day. You won't get that literally written in the Torah, but you will certainly have it hinted to, especially if you're doing Creation Gospel Workbook 1. When you get to the 5th day of creation, there's lots of stuff to internalize about the resurrection in that seed prophecy of the 5th day of resurrection, the 5th spirit of Adonai, which is Gvorah, power, resurrection power. And so it just logically follows that the greater body of Messiah is expected to be resurrected at the Feast of Trumpets. The Jewish way of looking at this is that each year, starting with the Feast of Trumpets, it really is that newborn baby. I know we see that a lot on secular New Year cartoons and so forth. The New Year is a baby. I don't know where they got that. Maybe they got it from the Jewish tradition. At any rate, each new year, each turn or going out of the year, as the Feast of Trumpets is called, it's newborn. It's a new year of decrees in your life. It's recorded on that day what you will go through in that coming year, whether you will live, whether you will die, the obstacles that will be put in your path, the blessings that will also be put into your path. And so as it moves through the year will age, and at the very end it will die. And so those who are walking through these feasts get the idea that I'm a newborn, I'm resurrected, I'm a newborn on the Feast of Trumpets. And as I walk through the year, I'm aging, maturing, aging, maturing, aging, maturing. And as I walk with the Holy One, what I expect is that when I reach the Feast of Trumpets again, that I will be figuratively resurrected as a newborn, and then he will give me a new year of obstacles to overcome. Some years you're going to have the shofar for a Shemitah year at this time of year. Some years at these holidays you're going to have the Yovel, the Jubilee year. Truly a new birth. The thing to remember about sleeping is that it's figurative of death. So you're going to fall asleep in the synagogue is one way of looking. Now, you're not literally falling asleep in the synagogue on the Feast of Trumpets, but it's understood that this is the end of your life on the Feast of Trumpets. And so you are going to fall asleep, which is figurative of death, just as, remember, Adam and Abraham were both put into a deep sleep before they were awakened to have a realization of a double covenant, where they see themselves as doubles. For Abraham, it was the promise, the twin promises given to him and Sarah. For Adam, he wakes up and he has a wife. He definitely has a double covenant there. Double as in not two covenants, but a covenant that produces a double. And so that sleep of death has to occur. And then when you hear the shofar in the synagogue, then you're going to be resurrected, either to a new year of life or resurrected into the greater body of Messiah at this resurrection, where Adonai himself is going to descend, and we are going to ascend, and we will forever live within his presence. Now, because Paul writes to the Thessalonians what he does, that this word he's writing to them about the resurrection is by the word of the Lord. Our question is, well, which word are you referring to, Paul? Because we would like to know where in the Word you found these things. Because for most readers, especially of the New Testament, when they read that, they feel like there's no context for it. Before that, like they're giving this brand new prophecy on the resurrection, and it's not brand new at all. The seeds are in the Torah. We find them, like I said, on day 5 of creation, with the creation of the birds and the fish, which are the first living creatures, not the first living creations. We had trees and plants before that, but these are the first living creatures. We can also find extensive hints to this resurrection in 3 Torah portions, more than 3, all of them actually, but 3 that are just heavy with resurrection information. That's in the Torah portions, Beha Alocha, Kitisa, and Pekudei. And if you string those 3 Torah portions together they'll say, in your going up, when you elevate, at the reckoning. And so you can see it's a not even so subtle hint in the Torah portions that if you want to understand what Paul's talking about, when you go up, when you elevate, at the accounting, at the reckoning, for the dead, the first resurrection, then this is where you would turn. You would go to those 3 Torah portions especially to find out that information. And of course, like I said, some of you will be familiar with this from the book 50,000 Degrees and Cloudy. And the first set of slides is very heavy into that book. It's as we pull out in the next lesson that we're making more links into the book of Revelation. But I know we've got some new students, so we want to make sure we don't leave them behind. Didn't mean that as a pun or a joke. At any rate, if you want to take a look at that, if you go to Kitisa, when you elevate, you'll go to Exodus 30:11 through 34:35. And then you'll go to Pekudei, which means an accounting, a reckoning. That's Exodus 38:21 through 40:38. And if you think of Rosh Hashanah, the Feast of Trumpets, elevation at that feast and accounting at that feast, in terms of resurrection, it's very heavy with those themes. Even when we get to Yom HaKippurim, the accounting theme is very heavy. And also at Sukkot, an ancient Jewish tradition, there's an idea that we've been elevated into Sukkot of glory as we dwell in the Sukkah, that we are being elevated, and we are so elevated at that point. In the tradition, even the patriarchs will come and spend time with us in the Sukkah each evening. They're called Ushpizin. And so it's thought that, at least symbolically, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, Elijah. In some traditions, it's Ushpizot. It's the female matriarchs and prophetesses who come to the Sukkah. The idea is it connects you with the righteous people of the past. You know, it's not for no reason that he says, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He wants you to connect with that spiritual heritage. And so by using the patriarchs and the matriarchs as these visitors during Sukkot, it helps put you into the mindset of you're part of this greater body. The very gathering that Paul is talking about, how it's not just those who are alive. He's going to resurrect from the dead. And so we'll all be caught up together with them in the clouds, with the Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the Sarah, the Rebecca, Leah, and so forth, that you'll be part of that body. So let's go back to it. It says, for the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout. Okay, the shofar is the equivalent of a shout, by the way. They have particular shofar calls, like the tekiah, it's like a hand clap. There's a teruah, there's a shout. He says he'll descend from heaven with a shout, with a teruah, with the voice of the archangel, with the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive and remain will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And so shall we always be with the Lord. Comfort one another with these words. He's describing here the Feast of Trumpets. But what he's also describing is the way that the Israelites moved through the wilderness in the clouds with the divine presence, that his presence dwelled among them in that transition journey between Egypt and Israel itself. Egypt, remember, represents the realm of death and destruction and being lost, Abaddon. And our destination is back to our inheritance in Israel. And there seems to be a very short, how would we describe it, staging ground in the wilderness. And had there not been a golden calf, and had there not been the 10 evil spies with the evil report, it wouldn't have taken them 2 weeks even to make it from Egypt or death into Israel and life, eternal life. But because of idolatry, because of unbelief, they could not enter in, and so they had to hang out in the desert in the staging area for 40 years. So his presence was still with them in the cloud. But if we're trying to put together our expectation of the resurrection, it may be that there is a little interim period in the cloud before we literally make it back into the land of Israel. It might be a 10-day period from Rosh Hashanah until Yom HaKippurim or Sukkot, which would be a separation of 10 or 15 days. I don't know if we're just kind of hanging around in the clouds, walking on the clouds. I suspect what is happening during that interim time is that we're getting used to our new bodies. Just imagine, if you were like Naaman when he came up out of the Jordan, it said his flesh was just like a baby's flesh. You have that smooth skin. Everything works. Nothing hurts. You're not earthbound. Feeding on manna, perhaps instead of natural food. Feeding on spiritual drink instead of natural water. I'm sure there'll be all sorts of changes that will take place with our resurrected body. And we'll need 10 to 15 days probably to get used to our new skin that we're walking in. At any rate, the shouting, the trumpet, the resurrection, these are all themes associated with Rosh Hashanah, the Feast of Trumpets. And being in the cloud with the angel of the presence, because Paul says with the voice of the archangel, he's going to come. Well, the angel of the presence, remember, abode with Israel in their wilderness walk after they were redeemed from Egypt. And they entered the cloud on the first stop. They came from Ramses to Sukkot. And from then on, Jews refer to that period in the wilderness of dwelling in the clouds as Sukkot of glory. And Paul even assumes that these reminders of the feasts, Passover, Sukkot, especially trumpets, that this is going to be words of comfort for those who hear. If you know the Exodus story, then this brings you comfort, because you also know with the Exodus story is the resurrection of Yeshua and a new body. Perhaps the complaining and so forth that characterize the wilderness journey will not be part of our experience. I certainly hope not. I don't know that we would survive, but hopefully with that resurrected body, there's a complete transformation, and we get the short trip from Egypt to Israel. So let's look at 1 Thessalonians 5:1. Now as to the times and the epochs, brethren, you have no need of anything to be written to you. For you yourselves know full well that the day of the Lord will come just like a thief in the night. While they are saying peace and safety, then destruction will come upon them suddenly, like labor pains upon a woman with a child, and they will not escape. But you, brethren, are not in darkness, that the day would overtake you like a thief. You are all sons of light and sons of day. We are not of night nor of darkness. This takes us back to a lesson we had recently on how you light the menorah. Remember, the menorah had to shine through the night. But if you ever let the altar sacrifice fire go out, then you could not light the menorah that evening, and you could not shine through the night. And he's saying, don't be like that. Make sure that your altar of sacrifice is eternally lit, so that every night you can light your menorah, and darkness will not overtake you like a thief. Because that's really what the darkness does. When you sit outside and the sun goes down, the lights don't go out instantly. They just kind of steal away. And all of a sudden the light is replaced with darkness. And he's saying, don't let it overtake you like that. Don't sit there thinking, well, I've got 5 more minutes. I've got 5 more minutes. I've got 5 more minutes. You may not, because before you know it, the sun is set. But he says, you are sons of light and sons of day. We're not of night nor of darkness. We keep our menorot lit. You can also look at the thief in the night as kind of a hint to Rosh Hashanah, the Feast of Trumpets, because one of its nicknames is the day and the hour that no man knows. And in fact, it's celebrated for 2 days, even in Israel, because of the hiddenness of the day at the new moon. So what is the day? Well, possibly, he says, the day of the Lord will come just like a thief in the night. Well, remember, starting back at the creation, the day, not a temple day, but the 24-hour day begins in the evening. There was evening and there was morning one day. Evening and morning, day 2, and so forth. And so as the evening sets in, like a thief in the night, it begins the day. And it's about that time of evening that you do have to sight the new moon to know whether you've started a new month. If you started a new month, then you can declare the Feast of Trumpets. And because of doubt, sometimes you can't spot it on the first night. There might be cloud cover, there might be atmospheric, dusts and things in the atmosphere. Maybe your witnesses don't come in. And so it was celebrated for 2 days, just to make sure we didn't miss the day, an hour that no man knows. It's because of doubt. It's because it's not the most certain thing that you'll see that moon come up in the evening. So he says, you be careful. You make sure you're taking your fire from the altar of sacrifice to the menorah every night, so that you will burn through the night, so that your spirit won't burn low. And so when the day sets in at the evening, that it won't creep up on you like a thief. There's another principle applied to the diaspora, to the exile. They also needed this additional day for feasts, not just Rosh Hashanah. They added it to other feasts. out in the exile, there was doubt because you didn't have the certainty of a Sanhedrin who could validate the words of the witnesses. And so an ancient, custom set into place. If you're not in the land of Israel itself, you do celebrate the feast an extra day because you're simply not sure. They didn't have emails, they didn't have the internet, and so it might take time for the word to reach you. Now, they did have calendars. They did have calculated calendars that they could fall back on. If there's a prolonged cloudy period, you may not even know on the second day that it's the new moon, but you fall back on the calendar because you know from your calculation that it has to fall in here, this day or this day. But that became a custom outside, especially of Jerusalem, where they sanctified the new moon, or the Rosh Chodesh. And you needed to know that in the spring and the fall, because it would be difficult to have Passover on the proper date, or difficult, again, not just to have Rosh Hashanah on the proper date, but then also to have Yom HaKippurim, also to have Sukkot on the proper dates. And so if you didn't know the new month with certainty, therefore, the farther you were from Jerusalem, the more likely it was that you were going to celebrate each festival for an extra day. For instance, today, if you live in Israel, you're going to combine Simchat Torah, which would actually be a 9th day, with the 8th day, with Shmini Atzeret. If you live outside Israel, if you'll notice on your calendar, it might denote a 9th day as Simchat Torah. What are they doing? They're adding that extra day because of doubt. In case we missed the new moon, we're going to celebrate an extra day. All right, so I want to remind you of a principle that's usually applied to Pesach, but it's considered a general principle that you can take that principle and apply it to another feast. For instance, if you were to miss the Passover, then in the Torah you were permitted a Pesach Sheni, which is the second Passover, 1 month later. It's kind of the second chance principle. And rather than catch you doing something wrong, it says you might be on a far journey, you might be unclean because of a corpse, then he says let them do it a month later. I want to give them the opportunity to remember this feast because it's vital in understanding the resurrection and so forth. So let's think of Yeshua as a first fruit of resurrection. There's going to be a crop that will follow him. If he's the first fruit, then he represents the entire field that will also be resurrected. So in that sense, what we're calling the first resurrection at the Feast of Trumpets that Paul was talking about, it's not really the first because there was already a first. Maybe we call it a pre-resurrection. But we know that Yeshua was the first resurrection of the dead. But perhaps since we will be resurrected with him at the Feast of Trumpets, that is also called the first resurrection of the greater body of Messiah. So there was a pre-resurrection where even the righteous people, the saints, were seen walking around the holy city after they were resurrected. That might be first resurrection part A. But then first resurrection part B will be that time when the greater body of Messiah is resurrected from the dead. And this is foretold again by the Israelites in the clouds of glory after the Exodus. So this first resurrection that Paul is writing about, which, like we say, it might be first resurrection part B after Yeshua, he says we're going to be gathered into the clouds of glory for Sukkot, or Sukkot of glory at that time, so that those who were resurrected with Messiah in Resurrection A, and those who will be resurrected with Messiah in Resurrection Part B will all be resurrected together into the Sukkot of glory at that time. So again, where are these Torah seeds? Well, again, you go back. Day 5 of creation. He created these feather-covered birds and fish. He called them swarms. And the root, the Hebrew root of swarms, ratz, it's a root word that connotes huge numbers of very quickly moving feet. And so these swarms of birds flew above the earth, but remember, they flew within the breathable air. Birds don't go out of the atmosphere. They don't fly up in the stratosphere. Likewise, their twins, the fish, they were hidden. They swarm in the waters. So there's feather-covered birds swarming above the earth, but in breathable air. But there's also fish who are hidden in the water, breathing the oxygen and the water. They're kind of hidden away, but they're still there. So that gives us 2 Torah seeds from the first week of creation. We've got being above the earth, covered and hidden from sight, but not far away at all. And that's a principle of dwelling in the sukkah. Symbolically, at least, you're leaving your home. Even if your sukkah's in your backyard, you left home. And in the Jewish tradition, when you dwell in the sukkah, even if you are in your own backyard, even if you're on your own balcony or porch, it's still counted as if you left the exile of Egypt or Babylon to return to Israel in the holy city. Now let that sink in. It's as if you left the exile of Egypt or Babylon to return to Israel and the holy city. Because see, we've been faced with that the last couple years. Even if we wanted to go to Jerusalem for the feast, we couldn't get in because of the siege of COVID. But here's one of the prayers you pray from the Sukkot prayers, the traditional Sukkot prayers. In one of these prayers, you pray, "And in the merit of my leaving my house, as if I have wandered afar, and from my sin purify me." So no matter where your sukkah is, you pray, "In the merit of leaving my house, as if I have wandered afar, from my sin purify me." Right? That kind of takes us back to the Pesach Sheni. Remember, one of the qualifications for somebody who got a second chance at Passover was if you were on a far journey. Pretty cool, huh? If I were on a far journey. So you pray that prayer in the sukkah. So it's as though you're saying, wait a minute. You know what? The Spirit is about second chances. And something as simple as making a shaky, breaky dwelling of twigs. Something I can see the starlight through the roof. Even in that, even if I'm in my backyard, I'm like those people who have wandered afar. Purify me from my sin because you know my intent, you know my intention. So your intention of leaving your home to dwell in a temporary place, and I would say probably most of you have done something, even if it is your backyard, but you may have traveled to meet with another group. You might have been camping in tents. You might have been in cabins, or like us, you might have been in an RV. We had a couple in a teepee. That was the coolest thing ever. At any rate, your intention was to leave your home, dwell in a temporary place, and by doing so, you made a very specific appeal to the Holy One. The very fact that you left home for your tent or your sukkah or your gathering, that very act was an appeal to the Holy One. It was a prayer. Your leaving home was a prayer. Your leaving your own bed was a prayer. And the appeal is, cover me under the wings. Jewish tradition calls it the Shekhinah, the indwelling presence. Shechan means to dwell. And the spirit words in Hebrew are feminine. So it's saying, please cover me under your wings during the judgment of the wicked on earth. See, these prayers, they start edging you over toward apocalyptic themes. And so you're saying, as I dwell in my sukkah, if there's judgment going on in the earth, and there is, then I'm appealing to you, the very fact that I left home. Please cover me with your wings during this judgment that's being executed on earth right now. Here's what it says in Deuteronomy 32:10. For the Lord's portion is his people. Jacob is the allotment of his inheritance. He found him in a desert land and in the howling waste of a wilderness. He encircled him. Remember the rivers of Eden and how they circled the garden? He encircled him. He creates a garden of Eden in the wilderness. He cared for him. He guarded him as the pupil of his eye. This is what you're praying for when you leave home at Sukkot. It says, like an eagle. Remember day 5 of creation, the feather-covered birds? Like an eagle that stirs up its nest, that hovers over its young, he spread his wings and caught them. He carried them on his pinions. The Lord alone guided him, and there was no foreign god with him. He made him ride on the high places of the earth. All right, so Israel did not realize what was happening to them in the wilderness. They're getting supernatural bread, they don't really get it. They're getting supernatural manna, they don't really get it. They have the indwelling presence of Adonai in their camp. They don't really get it. He's telling them, you think you're in a natural place, but you are in Sukkot of glory. You are riding on the high places of the earth. I'm carrying you on my wings. I'm carrying you, at least for them, in a state of semi-resurrection. Their garments didn't wear out. Their shoes didn't wear out. The bread is right there for them to gather. It's Yeshua. He says, I was the bread of heaven. I'm feeding you from heaven itself. And you didn't get it because you were so earthy. You were like the Adam that identified with the dirt instead of the Adam that was like his creator. If you were like your creator, then you would have recognized that you were riding on the high places of the earth. So think about your Sukkot gathering. Again, whether you were in a tent or a sukkah in your backyard, whether you visited with a group, or if you're fortunate enough to be in Israel for Sukkot. Now match what he's saying right here with where you were at Sukkot. You might have felt like, well, you got cold in the tent last night. You might have felt like, what, rain through my sukkah. You might have felt like the interstate tore out the bottom of my RV. But he's saying, no, your choice to gather in to Sukkot, you were actually riding on the high places of the earth, and you did not realize it. That is just the coolest ever. So we've got this eagle analogy, and it pops up in the Jewish commentary about observing Sukkot. And they say it's the clouds that connect Passover to Sukkot. Remember, they left Egypt at Passover, and they entered into Sukkot, Sukkot of glory. And they say that likewise, the commandment of dwelling in Sukkot is in order that your generations may know that I caused the children of Israel to dwell in Sukkot when I brought them forth from the land of Egypt. So that's something that's important for the next generation to know. It's something that each generation needs to know, that he caused the children of Israel to dwell in Sukkot when they came out of the land of Egypt. I think that hammers home to them the importance of observing Sukkot, living in Sukkot at the appointed times, the importance even of coming out of Egypt, having that relationship with Yeshua, with salvation, but it's also rehearsing them in this greater resurrection with Yeshua. So Israel journeyed in Sukkot of glory, but they were a prophecy of a final Sukkot, so that Adonai's heritage that he carried on his wings, that they may finally be seated or dwell. See, he didn't want it to always be a temporary thing. He wants it to be a step toward the permanent. It says there's a Jewish commentary on Sukkot. It says, when a person sits in the sukkah, the shade of faithfulness, the Shekhinah, spreads its wings over him from above, and righteous ones make their dwelling with him. These are called ushpizin, or guests, sometimes the 7 shepherds of Amos. They're thought to be Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, Aaron, and David. And of course, there's also a list of the ushpizot, the matriarchs and the prophetesses, like Huldah and Deborah, Sarah, Rivka, and so forth. But at this point, it helps us to understand why this shepherds by night symbol needed to be attached to Yeshua's birth during the fall feasts. And in fact, if someone had offered Joseph and Mary a sukkah, we read manger, I suspect it was a sukkah. Because remember, Jacob built Sukkot for his cattle. You can see where those two things would be very close. But whoever would have offered Joseph and Miriam a sukkah at that particular time would have been fulfilling a very important mitzvah, which is to provide for the poor at Sukkot. We know they were poor because all they could bring, for sacrifice was the pigeons, the doves. And the idea is when the Ushpizin come to visit you, of course they're not real, they're not really there. Maybe they're in spirit or something. But the idea is you think of them, and that motivates you to feed the poor, to invite the poor into your sukkah and to feed them there. So if somebody had invited Joseph and Mary into their sukkah so that she could have a child, that would have been pretty awesome. Imagine the blessing that would have fallen on them. So our bird theme, it begins on the 5th feast, the Feast of Trumpets, and that's the creation day of birds and fish, the 5th day of creation. It's also called the Day of Blowing. And this is the time when the eagle begins its return to its sleeping chicks. It's going to overshadow them with its wings. Remember Yeshua saying, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how many times I would have gathered you as a hen gathers her chicks, but you would not." The gathering of Jerusalem is the feasts, Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot. And you might say, well, when did he say this? Did he say this at Sukkot? I think you have to look at Passover and Sukkot. Remember, they come from the same spot on the menorah. We would say yes. If he's saying it at Sukkot, he's saying it at Passover. If he's saying it at Passover, he's saying it at Sukkot. That same commentary about Sukkot says the eagle arouses its nest. It takes pity on its young. If, upon returning to its nest, the parent bird finds the eaglets asleep, it will first flit from branch to branch, beating its wings and shaking the foliage until the gentle sounds awaken the young ones, so that they will not be overwhelmed with the sudden manifestation of his full splendor and glory. The intimation there is as the eagle kind of gently wakes up its young so they're not frightened and just fall out of the nest, because the eagle's a pretty huge animal. If you've ever seen an eagle with its wings stretched out, it's a massive bird and it's a powerful bird. But it awakens its young gently. And they say the Holy One is like this. He is so full of splendor and glory that there are stirrings, that he will do things to kind of wake you up before you get that full manifestation of his splendor and glory, so that you just won't be aroused out of a dead sleep. He wants, where it says, awake you sleeper, arise from the dead. You're going to hear some beating of wings first. And by the way, the lower garden, the Garden of Eden, as we would understand, it's also, Paul calls it the third heaven. In the tradition, the palace of Messiah is located in the Garden of Eden. And it's called the Kan Sipur, the bird's nest. And so what is Yeshua trying to do? He's trying to stir up his chicks, because his goal is to bring them back to the nest in the garden. Because remember, the Torah says, if the chicks get separated from the mother bird, then they're fair game, they're prey. But if the chicks will stay with the mother, then you can never separate the mother bird and the chicks. And Yeshua is saying, I'm the mother bird, and I was calling you so that you wouldn't be separated from me in death. He says, but you would not. And so to this day, he still calls us. He calls us to Passover. He calls us to Shavuot. He calls us to Sukkot. He says, gather with me so that you will not become prey in a time of judgment. Because if you will stay with me in the garden, then you can't be harmed by divine decree. Leviticus 23:24 says, speak to the sons of Israel, saying, in the 7th month, on the 1st of the month, you shall have a rest, a reminder by blowing of trumpets, a holy convocation. So it's a feast of remembrance. It's a reminder, a remembrance in Jewish tradition. And as one of the 7 feasts, it's also a rehearsal. It's practice for a prophetic event. It's his way of rousing you up. Every year you can hear his wings beating around the nest so that it won't scare you when it actually happens. It says, blessed is he who knows the sound of the shofar. When you hear it blow for real, you won't be surprised. You won't be frightened. You won't fall out of your nest. And Paul would not have expected his readers to forget the Feast of Trumpets as one of those 7 messengers to come in at Sukkot. It wakes us up. So with Paul's explanation, the Lord himself descends from heaven with a shout and with a trumpet, but the saints are caught up. Where are they going? Where is up? Well, if we look at the Greek word for air at Strong's 109, it isn't that high up. In fact, you are able to breathe normally. The definition is it's air, particularly the lower and denser air, as distinguished from the higher and rarer air. See, it's entirely possible if you sat in your sukkah at night and you looked through the branches that you could see into the Garden of Eden, that you could see into the gathering place above. It's because it's another realm. We think it's far, far away. It's not. It's close up. It's near you. It's even in your mouth. It's in your heart. It's in your obedience. It's in your gathering at the feasts. That you can literally see into the Garden of Eden with your spiritual eyes. If you couldn't, then you wouldn't be there, right? So, the Talmud records that the Spirit of God is no higher above the waters than a dove would fly. And that's based on the opening verse of Genesis, about how the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the water. And the fluttering action of the Spirit of Elohim that was fluttering over the water, it's the same word that describes how a bird flaps its wings really hard. Like if a mother chicken is trying to get the chicks up under her wings because she sees danger coming, she'll beat those wings really fast to get their attention. And so that's where they're deriving that the spirit of Elohim is hovering. It's beating its wings over the surface of the water, so it's not that high up. It's not out, beyond Mars or even Pluto. And then when we read in Mark 1:10 about Yeshua immediately coming up out of the water, it takes us back to the water of Genesis 1:1. He saw the heavens opening and the Spirit like a dove descending upon him. So you can see how that divine presence, that divine Spirit, it opens up, and it kind of establishes what the rabbis are saying about the Spirit of God and where the Garden of Eden might be located. It's not that high up. Of course, high and low in the natural realm is not exactly equivalent of high and low in the spiritual realm. But the doves represent this supernatural hovering kingdom that connects with our natural world. And Yeshua was always preaching how the kingdom was really close to us. So if we put that in the context of Noah was hovering over the surface of the earth in water, like the Spirit of Adonai. He's in this ark. He's in this place of safety. Think of Yeshua walking on water. And so as the waters sink down to their natural levels, Noah also descends from this supernatural preservation back into the natural earth. And the dove eventually brings back an olive twig to tell Noah it's okay to come out. Basically, you can now descend from those protective wings of the eagle, of the indwelling presence, and you're free to move about the cabin. You can understand that here is this olive twig. It's thought to have been taken from the Garden of Eden as a sign to Noah that it's okay. You can go out now. Look at Abraham's sacrifice between the pieces. The doves weren't split apart. They were left whole. It's that symbol of how the spirit is unified with the body and soul when it ascends to Sukkot of glory at the resurrection. And it's understood that on Rosh Hashanah, at the Feast of Trumpets, God sits in judgment over all the earth. Everybody passes under the shepherd's rod for reckoning their fate. And if you'll remember this little bit of trivia, it explains something. The Egyptians hated shepherds. They hated shepherds. Why would they hate shepherds? Well, see, they had their own Book of the Dead. If Adonai is the shepherd holding the rod of accountability and judgment, which is associated with Rosh Hashanah, then you can see why the Egyptians would hate him, because Egypt represented death. So on Yom Kippur, those judgments that were made at Rosh Hashanah, they're sealed, and they're passed on to the king for execution. And when the gates are closed at Yom HaKippurim, don't expect the world to fall apart instantly. There's still court proceedings. The judgment is being sealed at that time. The judgment is being passed to the king, and then execution will begin at Sukkot. Sukkot is considered the time of the water judgment. Passover is the time of the grain judgment. Shavuot is the time of the fruit judgment, the fruit of the tree. That's just a little bit of trivia. So on Sukkot, if you go into your sukkah, one of the prayers is, may you endow me with the privilege to dwell and take refuge in the sheltering protection of your wings. At the time of my departure from the world, to take refuge from the stream of fire and the fiery rain, when you rain coals upon the wicked, may you seal the book of life for our benefit and allow us the opportunity to dwell many days upon the land, the Holy Land, in your service and in your reverence. That's a pretty incredible prayer, right? It becomes apocalyptic. It's no longer just a holiday where everybody gets together and they build a sukkah and live in tents or whatever in the wilderness, outside of their own comfortable beds. Instead, one of the prayers acknowledges that it will be during Sukkot that the world will experience a stream of fire and fiery rain upon the wicked. And so if you were sealed in the book of life from Rosh Hashanah to Yom HaKippurim, that you were being given refuge, you were sheltering at Sukkot under his wings. Just like the eagle, he carried them on eagle's wings, same thing is happening. Isaiah 4:6 describes the protective cloud, which gives the righteous refuge from the stream and the rain, the stream of fire. The stream of fire you can find in Daniel 7:10, if you want to look that up. And it's going to engulf the wicked as described in Jeremiah 23:19. And the rain refers to the fiery coals of Jeremiah. Because remember, in the spirit realm, water and fire are the same thing. They come from heaven, Shemayim. Revelation 12:13. It says, when the dragon saw that he was thrown down to the earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. But the two wings of the great eagle were given to the woman, so that she could fly into the wilderness to her place, where she was nourished for a time and times and half a time from the presence of the serpent. So again, it takes us back to the Exodus from Egypt, and the great eagle is going to protect the woman in the wilderness in her place for a time and times and half a time. Now, I know there's all sorts of stuff out there about the time and times and half a time. We do know it adds up to 3.5. We don't know 3.5 what. I know people think they know, but I don't think they do. And I think, just kind of going off script here, as we've been talking about how does Adonai shorten the time? Because it says if he did not shorten those days, even the elect, he had to shorten it for their sake because they could, be destroyed. Behold, I come quickly. That tells you that I'm coming sooner than was planned. The time is going to be shortened. And I've wondered, just based on this right here, because Daniel talks about a time, times, and half time. As we look at the menorah, there are 7 branches on the menorah. There's also 7 feasts. The rabbis emphasize so heavily being prepared at Passover, but at the same time being prepared at the Feast of Trumpets. And I've just wondered, what if chiastically that menorah snaps shut for the righteous, and that's how he nourishes her for a time, times, and half a time? As the world is undergoing the fire judgments for the fall feast, could it be that the woman Israel and her children who keep the commandments of God and the testimony of Yeshua, are they actually in this place of the cloud for the fall feasts that year, at that time? Don't know. Don't write that down. That's just a speculation. Just working with that chiastic menorah over the last month or two, it's kind of taken a form in the way that I could see it, but we don't know that for sure. Just an idea that the woman, Israel, would be nourished away from the presence of the serpent. And it is very consistent with keeping the feast, that she's in a temporary dwelling, a sukkah, possibly can even see outside, just like the Israelites. They could see outside the cloud. The problem is, the rabbis say that their enemies couldn't see them in the cloud. They would just come boiling out of that cloud if they wanted to do battle, and the enemy couldn't really strategize. Now, when they sinned, they would lose the protection of the cloud, and then they were just like any other warrior. Anyway, it says, the serpent poured water like a river out of his mouth after the woman, so that he might cause her to be swept away with the flood. Flood generally denotes wickedness. But the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and drank up the river which the dragon poured out of its mouth. So the dragon was enraged with the woman and went off to make war with the rest of her children who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Yeshua. All right, so if you leave your home at Sukkot to dwell in a sukkah, a temporary dwelling, in Jewish tradition, it says, though you left Babylon. That's the idea, in the Jewish mindset when you go into the sukkah. It's counted as though you left Babylon. Revelation 14:8 says, and another angel, a second one, followed, saying, fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, she who has made all the nations drink of the wine of the passion of her immorality. They drank of the passion of her immorality. So, going into the sukkah is like choosing not to participate in the immorality of Babylon and its systems. In fact, wine is a big part of celebrating Sukkot. It's consumed as a moral worship and a devotion to Adonai. It's part of Sukkot. For a different purpose do you consume wine in Babylon. In Babylon, the wine is consumed specifically for the loosening of morals. So you can see the two different sides of the wine at Sukkot. You either go into the sukkah with the wine as an act of moral worship, not to get drunk, devoting that joy to him, or you remain in Babylon and drink the wine of immorality. That's an interesting picture for us to apply at Sukkot. On the 6 days of Sukkot, the water and wine were poured out in a temple ceremony. And remember, at this time, the parchments containing the decrees were given to the angels to deliver. Those decrees that were made at Rosh Hashanah, they were sealed up at Yom Kippur. They've been now passed off to angels to deliver and to execute decrees by the king. And so on those 6 days of Sukkot, the understanding is the water and the wine is poured out in the temple, then these angels are beginning to execute judgments upon the earth. On the last day, Hoshana Rabbah, on the 7th day, it's understood that retribution to the wicked will begin at that point. Big time. On the 7th day of Sukkot, you will start to see retribution on the wicked. But those who have been gathered from Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur, they are seated in the protective clouds of glory, enjoying the splendor of the divine presence. They're safe from the serpents and the scorpions of Deuteronomy 8:15. So the serpent, remember, she's being nourished away from the presence of the serpent. She's seated in Sukkot of glory, whereas Egypt and Babylon are beginning to experience the wrath as the wine is poured out on them for their immorality. It's a different type of wine that Israel is drinking in the sukkah. This is a long passage, so I don't want to read it to you. I'll give you the passage. It's Revelation 16:2 through 12. I'd encourage you to go back and read that word for word. Revelation 16:2 through 12. It describes these angels executing the water and wine judgments of Sukkot. And you're familiar with it. It's the first angel went and poured his bowl out on the earth. It became a loathsome and malignant sore on the people who had the mark of the beast and who worshipped his image. The second angel poured out, and the angels continue pouring out these bowls of wrath. And remember, it's the wine of judgment, because they did not repent of their deeds, because they did not come out of Egypt and Babylon. Okay. But let's look in Revelation 16:13. Let's look at this seventh bowl of wrath that's associated with Hoshana Rabbah. It's the seventh day of Sukkot. It says, I saw coming out of the mouth of the dragon, and out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet, 3 unclean spirits like frogs. For they are spirits of demons, performing signs which go out to the kings of the whole world, to gather them together for the war of the great day of God the Almighty. Behold, I am coming like a thief. Blessed is the one who stays awake and keeps his clothes, so that he will not walk about naked, and men will not see his shame. Think about this as taking you all the way back to the Garden of Eden and the war that took place there between the will of Elohim and the will of the serpent. He says, keep your clothes, obey. Don't walk about naked. Don't let men see the shame of your disobedience. And they gathered them together to the place which in Hebrew is called Har Megiddo, or Armageddon. Then the seventh angel poured out his bowl upon the air, and a loud voice came out of the temple from the throne, saying, It is done. And there were flashes of lightning, and sounds and peals of thunder. And there was a great earthquake, such as there had not been since man came to be upon the earth. So great an earthquake was it, and so mighty. So this final bowl that's going to be poured out on Babylon, it's going to be poured out on the world. It's being poured out on Babylon and Egypt, because remember, those who won't repent mystically are called Egypt and Babylon. And so this bowl is poured out. Not something you need to worry about if you were gathered into the Sukkah. That's a different gathering. He says he's gathering the kings of the whole world to judge them. But see, you've already been judged. You were judged back at Rosh Hashanah. You were judged back at Yom Kippur. And so you're gathered into Sukkot of glory. But this gives you a picture of what it's like to be gathered into a Sukkot of wrath, or a Sukkah of wrath. And so he says, blessed is the one who stays awake and keeps his clothes. It's traditional, by the way, to stay awake and study Torah and Psalms on Hoshana Rabbah. The Torah scrolls removed from the ark. Sabbath garments, everybody's wearing Sabbath garments. The chazan, the cantor, he'll wear a white kittel, just like they do on Yom HaKippurim. And they'll recite a full Kedusha, which is part of the liturgical service. Kedusha is holiness. And so the idea here is there's no naked shame allowed in the garden. It'll get you kicked out of the garden. So we stay awake and we keep our clothes on the seventh day of Sukkot, on Hoshana Rabbah. We acknowledge, we make prayers of his holiness, so that we will not experience shame in the garden. And if you'll notice the Sabbath prayers, everybody acts like it's Shabbat on that seventh day, which it is. It's a high Sabbath. But it's very similar to the weekly Sabbath. And if you'll notice, the prayers are a little bit different. The traditional prayers are a little bit different on the weekly Sabbath. They're not like the weekday, the 6 days of the week. Just like Hoshana Rabbah is a little bit different from the 6 days of Sukkot. But on Shabbat, we don't ask God for a bunch of stuff in our prayers. It's supposed to be a day we put aside worries, and we don't think about the things we don't have. Instead, we add these 13 prayers of petition. Instead of asking the 13 prayers of petition, we have a single prayer that has several paragraphs, but in it we praise Adonai for the holiness of Shabbat, And this particular prayer is called the Kedushat Hayom, the holiness of the day. So the Kedushat Hayom, it's based in part upon Isaiah 6, verses 2 through 3, where it says, Seraphim stood above him, each having 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one called out to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And if you've ever been in a synagogue or even a messianic synagogue where they pray the Sabbath prayers, when they got to this section and they said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts, you'll notice everybody stood up on their tippy toes. Well, they said, Holy, holy, holy. That custom is based on this right here. Kind of being like the seraphim, where they kind of rise up and they say, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. Then you kind of go back down on your flat-footed. But it's an acknowledgement of the elevation of holiness. Remember, we're in clouds of glory. Ezekiel 3:12. The Spirit lifted me up. There's that lifting up again. And I heard a great rumbling sound behind me. Blessed be the glory of the Lord in his place. You've probably heard that in the prayers of Shabbat. And I heard the sound of the wings of the living beings touching one another, and the sound of the wheels beside them, even a great rumbling sound. So again, you go up on your tippy toes when you say, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And it represents, the same Spirit that lifted up Ezekiel. And here's what it says in Revelation 4, verses 6 through 8. Sounds just like what we read in Ezekiel and Isaiah. Before the throne there was something like a sea of glass, like crystal. And in the center and around the throne, 4 living creatures full of eyes in front and behind. The first creature was like a lion, and the second creature like a calf, and the third creature had a face like that of a man, and the fourth creature was like a flying eagle. And the 4 living creatures, each one of them having 6 wings, are full of eyes around and within. And day and night they do not cease to say, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God, the Almighty, who was and who is to come. So there's your passage from the Shabbat prayers being prayed right here in Revelation. And so you can see how the righteous have been gathered in by the eagle. You see that with the 4 living creatures. And they will be able to echo, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God, the Almighty, who was and is to come, because they are in Sukkot of glory, not in the Sukkah of judgment and wrath. Also from the Kedusha prayer, it's taken from Psalm 146:10. The Lord will reign forever, your God, O Tzion, to all generations. Praise the Lord. Well, Revelation echoes that, the reign. It says, Hallelujah, for the Lord, our God, the Almighty reigns. Give praise to our God, all you bondservants, you who fear him, the small and the great. You can definitely tell that the saints have entered into their Shabbat prayers. And we'll wrap it up, I guess, here with the Lulav, which we still do. Personally, you take a Lulav, which is the 4 species. You'll have the myrtle branch, the date palm branch, the willow branch, and then you'll have the etrog, which looks like a lemon. But you need that willow branch, because remember the ceremony that they would have in temple times that accompanied the water and the wine pouring ceremonies. But when you take that willow branch, it says the leaves of the willow are shaped like lips, and we beat them on the earth to symbolize our resolution that we will not sin with our lips again. During Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, Satan incites God's attributes of judgment against Israel. I suspect when Job got accused, it was in this very season. But now, after we have accumulated many mitzvot, we are confident that no one's lips, not even Satan's, can harm us. So we beat symbolic lips, the willow branch, to the earth. And so in Messiah Yeshua, we are clothed in his righteousness. We are clothed in his commandments. And so we take the Lulav at Sukkot and we beat it on the ground. And what are we doing? We're saying we're confident that no one's lips, not even Satan's, can harm us when we have on the clothes of Yeshua, that we're not walking about in shame, we're walking about in obedience. Well, that ceremony of Sukkot with the willow bundle, compare that to this, and the idea that you're beating those willow branches on the ground because they represent lips, that it's destroying the accusations of Satan against us. Revelation 12:9. It says, "The great dragon was thrown down, the serpent of old, who is called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, Now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Messiah have come. For the accuser of our brethren has been thrown down." That's exactly what we just read. That's why we take the willow branch. The accuser has been thrown down, he who accuses them before our God day and night. And they overcame him because of the blood of the Lamb and because of the word of their testimony. And they did not love their life even when faced with death. For this reason, rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. Woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has come down to you, having great wrath, knowing that he has only a short time. Well, see, it goes back to a Sukkot. The righteous have been gathered into the clouds. They put on the garments of Yeshua. They are not walking about in disobedience and shame in the Garden of Eden. They overcame him because the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony. So, beating those willow branches like their lips, what did it say? It says, we are confident that no one's lips, not even Satan's, can harm us. Is that not cool? So we beat symbolic lips, the willow, to the earth. So what is that saying? Satan and his angels were thrown down to earth. You've already beat those willow branches on the earth at Sukkot. You've already taken on the righteousness of Yeshua and obedience. And so it says, rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. That's why I say, know where you are at Sukkot. You're not just out in a tent. You're just not out in a leaky sukkah. You were dwelling in the heavens. You were awaiting that great shofar. And when Satan and his angels are thrown down, they'll be going after those on the earth who don't repent. They know they only have a short time. It says, now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Messiah have come. And Revelation, here's what it says in the Jewish liturgy. Please save the city that is perfectly beautiful. Please, Hashem, bring salvation. Bring Yeshua now. Isn't that cool? Now the salvation, the Yeshua, the power, and the kingdom of our God, and the authority of his Messiah have come. Well, they're praying for that. And the Sukkot liturgy. Please save the city, Jerusalem, that is perfectly beautiful. Please, Hashem, bring Yeshua now. Also in the liturgy, it says, all trees, let them sprout and save them. Well, remember Revelation 9:4, the angels were told not to hurt the grass of the earth, nor any green thing, nor any tree. Only the men who do not have the seal of God on their foreheads. So the righteous trees, the trees of righteousness, those who have taken the 4 species at Sukkot, he says, don't hurt them. And that's part of the liturgy. Let them sprout. Let them be saved. Don't hurt them. And then in Revelation, John sees it too, and he says, only harm the ones who don't have the seal of God in their foreheads. Revelation 21:12 says it had a great and high wall with 12 gates, and at the gates were 12 angels, and names were written on them, which are the names of the 12 tribes of the sons of Israel. The one who spoke with me had a gold measuring reed to measure the city and its gates and its wall, and the 12 gates were 12 pearls. The nations will walk by its light, and the kings of the earth will bring their glory into it. In the daytime, for there will be no night there. Remember, there won't be a night if the righteous are there, because they keep their menorahs lit. The light is the Lamb, the one in the midst of the menorah. That's why he says, be careful that I don't break off your lampstand. If you are not awake and keeping your garments and keeping your menorah lit through the night, you can't walk with me, because where I walk, it's only daytime. It says its gates will never be closed, and they will bring the glory and the honor of the nations into it, and nothing unclean, no one who practices abomination and lying shall ever come into it. Only those whose names are written in the Lamb's book of life. How do we greet one another at Rosh Hashanah from then until Yom HaKippurim? May your name be inscribed and sealed in the book of life. Why? Because you have passed under the shepherd's rod. You've measured up to the gold measuring reed to be able to become part of the glorious city. And what's the prayer? What's the liturgy? Save the city that is perfectly beautiful. What he says, the gates will never be closed there. And it's the testimony of Yeshua and the commandments of God. This is the experience of the cloud dwellers. And if that's part of your experience, then Sukkot is the season of your joy. It is the season of your joy. Because you know you will be part of the perfectly beautiful city, that the gates will be open, that you will be inscribed with the tribes, that you will have the garments of Yeshua, and that your menorah will not go out at night. You know that your accuser has been thrown down to the earth. And instead of being in the image of the beast, those who are earthbound, you will be in the image of Elohim. You will be domeh. You will be like him. So I hope that encourages you a little bit more about the season we just came through, the Sukkot season. And I hope it'll set you on fire now as we study a new cycle of Torah portions. And it'll make you really anticipate Passover. Because if you have the joy of Sukkot, then you're anticipating the Passover as well. And so we're going to take a break here. I'll try to get another one recorded, and we might have to get to a place where I can upload it, where there's enough Wi-Fi for me to do that. But then I'll follow up and I'll do a second recording, which is the second half of this teaching on Sukkot and how it fits into these apocalyptic expectations of Sukkot. So, goodbye for now. And we'll see you back for part 2.